let me just introduce you to the next speaker. Welcome, please welcome the CTO, Kevin Goldsmith, who is going to talk about distributed teams. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's the last session. How is everybody doing? How's it been so far these 2 days? Is everybody having a good time? Everybody learning? Yeah? Good. So I am Kevin Goldsmith. I am the Chief Technology Officer of Onfido, based in London. This is the second time I'm speaking here, but this is the first time I'm speaking here in this theater. Last time I was here a couple of years ago, I spoke and had a last-minute emergency that kept me in the United States, and so had to do my talk virtually. And I very much appreciate the organizers inviting me back to speak again, but also this is a very appropriate image to talk about leading distributed teams. So I've been leading distributed teams now for about 16 years, in several different companies. So I've been doing it a little bit. I have some things I've learned. So first of all, you're probably already in a distributed team. And you may think, well, no, we all sit together in an office in Budapest, right? So we're already together. We're not a distributed team. But most teams now would say, well, if somebody's child was sick and they had to work from home, or somebody was expecting a delivery and had to work from home, well, now, guess what? Your team is distributed. It may only be for a day or two, but you're going to deal with some of the problems I'm going to talk about. Or actually is becoming ever more common, everybody works from home. And some of you may be in Budapest, and you may be working with people in Vienna, and maybe some people in London, and people in the US or Canada or something. Or you may be in a team sitting in Budapest, working with a team in Berlin, and working with another team in São Paulo or something. This is becoming ever more common. And then things like coronavirus happens. And China, which is not known for being a distributed team country, becomes one very quickly. So Onfido is very much a distributed team. This is from a meeting I was in last summer, and you see me as Zoom, so you see me up there. And that day, I just happened to be in Seattle, and the person underneath me, she's working from home in London, and the person underneath her, he's working from home in San Francisco, and then there's a team sitting in London, and then somebody sitting in Lisbon, which is where our second largest office is. So this is a world that I live in all the time. And it's challenging. It's not easy to work in a distributed team. There's the problems that you see, the challenges around distributed teams, I have seen now in lots of places, whether the team is sitting in different continents, I've done that, whether the team is sitting in the same country but in different time zones in different cities, whether you're sitting on different floors of the same building, or even whether the team is distributed sitting in the same floor in the same building, you still see these problems come up again and again. And there's four main things I'm going to talk about. One is Conway's law. The other thing I'm going to talk about is Amdahl's law, empathy, which is probably obvious, and communication, which is also somewhat obvious. So let's start by talking about Conway's law. How many of you are familiar or have heard of Conway's law? I was talking to somebody about it earlier, so I know at least some of you do. For those of you who don't, I'm going to give you the very, very short lesson on Conway's law. Conway's law comes from this article, How Do Communities Invent? It was written by Melvin Conway and published in Datamation magazine in 1968, over 50 years ago. And we still talk about it today, which means something. Computer industry, he was a software architect. We don't work the way they worked in the 60s, but he saw something, and it was this. Organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of the organization. That is Conway's law. And it was called Conway's law by Fred Brooks in his book, The Mythical Man Month, which hopefully you've heard of. It's a classic in the literature of our industry. And what it basically means is who you talk to and what constrains your conversation, what constrains communication is absolutely going to be reflected in what you build. And we still talk about it over 50 years later because it has just proven itself over and over again to be true. In fact, while he wrote it in an article, and it's kind of like the 1968 equivalent of a blog post, really, and from a grumpy developer at that, if you read the article, which you can, by the way, you can download it off his website. It's 4 pages. It's absolutely worth reading. But it has been so true that Harvard Business School later studied 3,000 companies to actually try and prove Conway's Law and found very, very strong evidence for it. So why does this happen? Why does the communication structures reflect themselves on what we build? In the article, he calls it the homomorphic force. In mathematics, homomorphisms are mappings from one sort of linear graph to another. So the linear graph of your organizational model is mapped into the linear graph of your software, and it's a very natural thing. And part of the reason why it happens, and it happens very consistently, I spent a little bit of time thinking about Conway's Law, and I worked with somebody who studies the brain, Britt Andreatta, and she pointed out this element in your brain. This thing right here that I circled, that's called the entorhinal complex. That's a part of your hippocampus that actually stores maps in it. So it is how you know in this building how to get to the coffee or how to get from this theater back to your apartment or your hotel. It is also the thing that stores your org chart in your head. It also stores mental maps of those things. It's also what stores your software architecture. It stores those things as well. And it likes to find equivalences of things. And if those things that are mapped nearly to each other, but not quite, it creates actually a lot of tension because your brain wants them to be the same. And this is why Conway's Law is very problematic when we talk about distributed teams. Because this model of who you sit with physically and who you talk to over video becomes a mental map for you in your head, and your brain wants that to map to something else. But of course, this is just something in your head, right? So is Conway's Law, are we trapped by Conway's Law in the same way we're trapped by the second law of thermodynamics or something? And the answer is, of course not, right? It's a mental construct, right? We are evolved things, and so our brains, we can outsmart our brains. But the fact of the matter is, it's actually a lot harder to fight your brain than you think. So it's easier to understand Conway's Law and understand how the way your team is distributed and who talks to who more frequently than others, not because they need to, but because they just happen to, how that's going to end up infecting your software. So how do you work with it? You're deliberate. You understand this is going to be a challenge, and you try and work with it. You find those bottlenecks that conflict, the communication bottlenecks that conflict with your architecture, and you fix them or you change them. Or you introduce bottlenecks to support the architecture you're trying to build. You essentially design the organization to design the architecture, which is called, I believe my favorite phrase in our industry, the reverse Conway maneuver. So that is essentially designing the organization to design the architecture you want. And you can say, well, this all sounds very fine and abstract, but give me an example. And I can give you 3 off the top of my head: Amazon, Netflix, and Spotify. Amazon did this. When somebody yesterday was talking about 2 pizza teams. That's an Amazon construct. Amazon was building for scale. They wanted to build a modular software architecture that would support scaling very large. The 2 pizza team, the small team that owns a small set of services, is very much a mapping of that. Netflix learned from that model when it built its software architecture for the exact same reason. And I worked at Spotify. We absolutely learned from both Netflix and Amazon. So companies have done this and found that it worked to address this issue. So that's where Conway's Law comes into distributed teams. Let's talk about Amdahl's Law. How many of you know Amdahl's Law? It's a bit more, yeah. So Amdahl's Law doesn't really talk about organizational design, but because it's really about parallel processing. And the idea in Amdahl's Law is that the performance of the whole is only as fast as the slowest part, because really what it's talking about is parallel system performance. So you can think about it in terms of this. So if I'm going to do sort of a scatter-gather type pattern in solving a problem, and I'm going to take some amount of computation, I'm going to distribute it out to 5 workers running in parallel, and say 4 of them operate in 100 milliseconds and the last one operates in 2 seconds, what's the speed of the system? It's 2 seconds because everybody's waiting on that longest running process in order to collect the results and distribute them to people. How does this work in the organization? It works like this. This is what I would call the layer cake diagram, software architecture diagram of a team organization I ran at Adobe, building a connected photography product called Revel. And because of Conway's law, this was our architecture. Guess what the organization looked like? Yeah, every one of these boxes was a team. These teams were all in different cities. So the infrastructure team was spread between San Jose and Seattle. Server team was in San Jose. The core library team was in Seattle. The iOS team was in Minnesota. Android team was in San Francisco. And the web team was in San Jose. So each one of these teams sat in a different office, right? So which meant that they didn't really talk to each other that much. I mean, they did. It's not that we didn't allow them to. It's just they don't see each other. They don't bump into each other in the halls. They don't see each other at lunch. They don't talk to each other that often unless there's something planned for them to talk to. So the problem with this architecture, I mean, it worked fine. This is a very obvious way to build software, especially when we were building it. But the problem was if we wanted to build a new feature, we'd have this problem. Let's say we need a new database. So the infrastructure team would have to set up a new database. The server team would build the server-side implementation. The core library would build the business logic that was shared across the platforms. And then each of the client teams would implement it, which meant that the whole process took a very long time. It was very parallel. It was very waterfall, even though we were trying to work as agile and lean as possible. And we were trying to deliver things as quickly as we could. So this was a bit of a problem. And of course, could we speed up the slowest element here? If the server team was taking the longest, could we speed them up? Yeah, we could, but it wouldn't really make a big change there. Really, we had to rethink the whole system and go back to where our bottlenecks, what's slowing us down. And it wasn't the fact that each of these teams these functional teams were each doing their job. The problem was they were each working independently from each other. And so what we did, well, actually, we didn't do this. I left Adobe. I went to Spotify. Spotify figured this out. We built feature teams, these full-stack feature teams, specifically to solve this problem. So we took something that was serial and made it parallel. Essentially, we took this and made it that. This worked great, and this worked exceptionally well for distributed organizations, which my organization, Spotify, was. We were split between Stockholm, originally Stockholm and Gothenburg, later Stockholm, Gothenburg, New York, and Boston. By putting all this in the same place, in the same team, all these functions, that allowed each of these teams to run in parallel as fast as they could because they didn't have any strong dependencies on other teams. So they had everything. They had the infrastructure people in the team, they had the client people in the team, the back-end people in the team, test in the team, design in the team, everything they needed, which meant that a team operating in Stockholm had zero dependencies on a team in Gothenburg. It was kind of the exact opposite of the problem we had at Adobe. So it worked very, very well, and that allowed us to go much faster as an organization distributed across eventually 6 time zones. An important part of that, and this I learned also at Adobe. So at Adobe, and I've talked to lots of companies that have done this, maybe your development team is here in Budapest, but the product management team is in San Francisco or something, or somewhere else. Now, what does that mean? That means, well, you have a lot of people doing the work in one place, but a lot of the decisions, or maybe you have a product manager here, but everything needs to be approved by some other team in another location. That slows everything down. So bringing in local decision-making and allowing teams to make decisions and move forward without having to get everything approved makes sense. Do any of you work in an organization like this today? Yeah, a few. Oh, wow, okay. A bunch of people do. Yeah, that sucks. That's horrible. It is. It's a horrible way to work. You're just always having to wait on other people, right, to get stuff done. And certainly at Adobe, I used to have to fly. Even though I was in the same time zone, I would have to fly from Seattle to San Francisco to sit outside someone's office to get a decision made so that we could go back, so that we wouldn't have to slow our work down. I did that all the time. I would fly to San Francisco on an early flight and sit in the cafeteria and wait till the person I was looking for came in to get their breakfast on their way to their office so that I could corner them and get them, because we were tired of waiting on them. That's not a very efficient organization, is it? How do you do this well? Right? It's an easy thing to say. Well, you push decision-making into teams. There is a way to do it, and there's a way to do it with good accountability that you can maybe be able to convince people that this is a good idea. And I have done this at multiple organizations. First of all, someone like me, I'm the CTO. Do you really want me deciding do you really want me being the final arbiter on what microcontroller or which library we're going to use in this piece of the client? No, you really don't want me deciding that. Why? Because I'm here today. So if you're waiting on me to make that decision, it's not happening because I'm on stage right now. So instead, my job is to set the strategy for the organization. This is what we're trying to do as a group. This is what the goals that we're trying to achieve this year. And then for the teams in the organization, I need to make sure they have all the context they need to make that decision. And then they figure out, well, okay, in our world, like the stuff we're responsible for, we can figure out this is what we can do to deliver on that strategy. And rather than say like, okay, you just go, like you don't want me bugging you all the time saying, how's it going, how's it going, how's it going? Instead, what we do is we pick a KPI, some sort of metric that you can use and that I can agree if this number is going in the right direction or these 2-3 numbers are going in the right direction, you're doing generally the right thing. And so then you just have to tell me, hey, this is where our KPIs are going. And as long as it looks like it's going in the right direction, you're good. I don't need to bug you about anything. And you also know you're good and you don't need to worry. So this means that we have agreed on a set of things. I've given local control to you. We've agreed on a set of things that I'm going to look at and that you're going to report on that are going to tell me whether you're going in the right direction or not, and you're going to know you're doing the right things. And if that's good, then I really don't need to bug you, and you can just keep going. Empathy is an obvious thing, and we've talked a lot about empathy yesterday and today. It's especially important when we talk about distributed teams for this reason. Familiarity breeds trust. So 2 years ago, December 2017, I was on the stage, but I wasn't on the stage. I was on the screen, and I was several thousand miles away. Do you think that the experience of seeing me on that screen, no matter what I was saying or what amount of conviction I brought to what I was saying, do you think that's the same as seeing me standing here? No, of course not, right? You know, because you can see me, I am physically here. I am absolutely present. You know, if I say something you really disagree with, you can throw a glass at me or something like that. Please don't. But you could. Or if I say something you absolutely disagree with, you know, you can come after the talk and talk to me and say, hey, I really disagreed with what you said, and we can talk about it, right? We have, even though you've seen me yesterday or today or, talking and eating and being a normal person, right? You know I'm a person, not pixels on a screen. I might have pre-recorded that talk last year, except there was a Q&A at the end, but even still. I might have pre-recorded that entire talk. I might have been a deep fake or something. You had no idea. You know I'm here, and you know I'm saying. So look at these people, right? They're each on their own little screens. They're sitting together. If he is looking at his phone and he laughs, well, she could say, like, hey, what's funny? And he's going to talk to her. He's going to, oh, I just read this thing. If he wants to get her attention, he can tap on the table or tap her hand, try to get her attention. They're physically present. Even if they don't know each other that well, that breeds a level of familiarity, a level of human connection that is totally different from something like this. And how many of you have been in meetings like this, right? Like there's somebody on a screen and, the guy in front is maybe taking notes. He's probably reading his email. He may be on Slack. He may be shopping. He's not being seen by the camera. The person on the screen can't see him because he's sitting right underneath the monitor. But the person on the screen is like, oh, I'm saying something very important. And half the people in the room are like kind of paying attention, half the people aren't. If you and I are, if we're sitting at a conference table and I'm trying to say something important and you're reading your email, I'm gonna say, what the hell are you doing? I'm trying to talk to you here. That's really rude. But on this, it's acceptable. Why? Because you're not a person, you're pixels on a screen, right? That's just kind of how we are as humans. So I've had this problem in teams. One of the teams I led at Adobe, we were split between Seattle and San Jose, and like evenly split. And so we'd have team meetings where a bunch of us were sitting in one conference room and a bunch of the rest of the folks were sitting in another conference room. And every once in a while I'd notice the people in San Jose, if I was in Seattle, the people in San Jose were talking and their audio was off. They had muted themselves. And I'd say, hey, what's going on in San Jose? And they'd say, oh, sorry, we're just talking about what you're talking about. And I'm like, well, wait, why aren't we all talking about that? Oh, sorry, we just didn't think it was important that you heard it, right? When that's happened, and that happened a little bit more than I'd like, one of the things we did was we switched to this. At the time, we all had offices. Gives you a little bit of idea of how long ago this was. We all each had our own office. Imagine that. This isn't that team, by the way. This might actually be Happy Melly, a photo from Happy Melly. I don't know if Jurgen's still here to tell me whether it is or not. But we did this. I essentially said, everyone from now on, we're not going to do our team meetings in conference rooms. Everyone's going to go to your office, and we're all going to dial in. And so we'll all be dialed in. That way, if there's a conversation, there'll be one conversation. If you want to get your attention, you'll have to raise your hand or in some way indicate, and then we will all talk at the same level. It won't be some here and some there. So we do this a little bit differently at Onfido. So the executive team that I'm in, most of us are in London, but actually a lot of us are traveling all the time. And then we have three different U.S. cities. So we do this thing where we're kind of in a conference room in London, but each of us dials in on our laptops. Even if I'm looking at a presentation on like the big monitor, you can see my face because I'm dialed into the meeting as well. Because otherwise, you have big faces of the people who are dialed in from wherever, and then you have a big room with a bunch of people in it who you can't get any, you can't read their faces, you can't read their expressions. So we do this so that we can each see what each other is looking at or their expressions. We level the playing field. Another thing, I take notes on paper, and I do this, oh, sorry, I'm one slide off. This is Happy Melly. Wait, that's Happy Melly, I think, and this is taking notes on paper. So I've done this just generally in person meetings for a little while. I used to take notes on a laptop or on an iPad, and the problem I have, we had a talk yesterday about focus and distraction, and I'd see a Slack notification come up, and we're talking, or I'm in a meeting, and all of a sudden I'm reading Slack, and I stop paying attention. And so that's just me. And so I switched to taking notes on paper just to force myself to be present and to be involved in the conversation. Now, I would still take notes on the computer when doing a video meeting. And I would do that because then I'm looking at the screen, so it looks like I'm paying attention to you, even though I'm typing notes, and I'm telling you while I'm typing notes. But the same thing would still happen is somewhere in the background, I'd see a new email or a Slack message, and you're trying to tell me something very important, and I'm not paying attention to you anymore. So even when I'm on video, I will make the video the entire screen, and I will take notes on paper, and I will show you, if it's our first time, I will show you my notebook and my pen, and I say, hey, just so you know, if I'm looking down, it's because I'm taking notes. And every once in a while, I may actually purposefully shift so you can see the top of my notebook and the camera, or you can see my pen, and I do that very purposefully so that you know I'm listening to you, I'm paying attention to you, but I'm taking notes. We have this rule, this is another rule we created on Fido, but I think a lot of companies have that. If we're in a video meeting, you're not allowed to turn your video off. So we don't allow that. This is my Zoom avatar. We don't allow that in meetings, which means that, like if we were in a physical meeting, if we were all sitting together and I wanted to go get a drink or something, I would stand up and I'd walk out of the room and say, sorry, I'll be right back, and I'd leave the room. But if I just turn off my video, you don't know if I'm there or not there, can't see my face. But if I'm at home in a meeting, I will just get up, walk out of the room, and you can see my empty chair on the video, but you know I'm not there. And so you don't try and address me or bring me into conversation. And so that's just a thing we do, again, just to make sure that we try and respect those tropes of human-to-human interaction and to level the playing field as much as we can. Another thing to look out for is warning signs, and you can pick these up. And it's your company, every company is going to be different on how it does it. But this was especially when I had this team that was spread between 2 offices, San Jose being the headquarters, but I was actually located in Seattle. Every once in a while, somebody on my team would say to somebody in San Jose, "Well, that's fine for you people, but this is different for us." Right? Or I'd hear it both ways. I'd hear the San Jose people say, "Well, that's great for you in Seattle, but we don't get to do that," or something like that. And what that really means is we were no longer a team, and we were no longer people to each other. It was us and them. And some of us were now pixels on the screen instead of people. And so when that happens, well, one of the things I would do is I'd say, well, it's time for us all to get together. We've forgotten that we're humans. We are now just pixels, so let's be humans again. So I would get us all together, and I did this. This is actually a photo of my team from one of our meetings at Spotify where we did the same thing. So when my team was split between Seattle and San Jose, every quarter we would all get together, because that would be about once a quarter. I'd hear this, "Well, you people" kind of thing. So we'd get together about once a quarter in one place all together, and we'd do meetings or we do something fun, social. All I really wanted to do was have people speak to each other and remember, hey, you're actually a person, and I know you, and I like you, and I actually care about, that you saw this movie or whatever. And we did the same thing. Even when my team grew substantially, when I was running Revel, the team was in Seattle, San Francisco, San Jose, Minneapolis, individuals in Oregon, Virginia, just Canada. We just had people everywhere, but we'd still get together on a fairly regular basis. At Spotify, it was the same. We'd alternate between Stockholm and Gothenburg once a quarter. We'd get together. We'd do an own conference. We'd do something fun. The whole point was just to remind people that they're people and not pixels. And this is incredibly valuable. Teams I know, companies I know that are 100% distributed all over the world, they'll still get together physically once or twice a year for maybe even a couple weeks to really establish those human bonds. If you're a leader, as many of us are, and you're responsible for people in multiple locations, you got to travel. You got to travel a lot. It's okay to say, well, everyone gets to see me on video, but you want your boss to know you as a person a little bit. You want them to know that you play football on the weekends, or that you like to roller skate or something like that they actually know you. And as a boss, you kind of want the people that work for you to think of you as a person and not this kind of thing in another city that they have no interaction with. And you would be absolutely surprised how many companies I talk to that are distributed across multiple locations that the managers never travel. You talk to people in an office and they say, well, no, they've never come here. The senior people have never been here. And that feels really like they don't care about us. But it's also, imagine this, like you have a peer, let's say you work in the headquarters and your boss is in the same location and you have a peer in another city, and so you see your boss every day. You see him getting coffee, you see him in the elevator. This person in another city never sees him, and maybe on a screen. But that person's going to feel like if you get promoted or you get a bigger raise, that person's going to be, well, of course you do, because you're hanging out together all the time. That boss doesn't even know who I am, even though we're peers, right? As a boss, you really don't want those kind of narratives happening. So I make a point. I travel. So our engineering team on Fido is split between London, Lisbon, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. I am in Lisbon at least. I try to be there at least once a month for at least a couple days. And when I'm there, I'm just working. I'm just hanging out. But I want those people to know they can come up to wherever I'm sitting and talk to me. I'm gonna have conversations with them, getting coffee. I'll go to lunch with them if they're all going out to lunch together. And just so that they know that I am seeing them, I am acknowledging them, I know that they're people, and I want them to know the same thing. And Albuquerque obviously is a little harder, but I'll still try and get there at least a couple times a quarter. So it's very important, if you're the leader and you're responsible for people distributed, that you actually make a point of going and seeing them in person. Another thing is humanizing. The interesting thing about the Gothenburg office for Spotify is it was created relatively early in the life of the company. And so the people who work in that office are used to being this sort of remote team. They were the first remote office. And they got very good at reminding everyone that they're people and not pixels. So we used to do this thing in my tribe where we'd have a demo, tribe demos, each of the squads would demo to each other once a month. And periodically, the Gothenburg team would do something like this. So we dial in, like we're all sitting in a big room in Stockholm. You can see there's a bunch of people working from home. And then, we dial into Gothenburg, and they're all wearing onesies. And when you just show up, you see these people, and they're all dressed as animal onesies people. Like, these are people. These are not pixels anymore. And I remember I once dialed into a meeting in Gothenburg where I was just individually dialing in. And one of the things we used to do in Stockholm was we'd do Fancy Fridays. I don't know if you've done this because we're developers, so everybody's t-shirt and jeans. Every once in a while, we'd do Fancy Friday. Everyone would dress up and come to work. And I dialed into a meeting. I was wearing like a shirt and a jacket and a tie. And they're like, "Why are you dressed up, Kevin?" And I said, "Oh, we're doing Fancy Friday in Stockholm." They're, "Oh, okay." The next tribe demo, we dialed in, and they were all wearing evening wear. So they were all wearing tuxedos and ball gowns, and it was absolutely hilarious. These became people, not pixels. They humanized themselves. Another important part, so let's say your team is actually all in Budapest, and you all sit together, except maybe somebody's has to work from home. So our teams were co-located, even though the organization was distributed at Spotify, but every once in a while, somebody's got to work from home. So we would do things like this, where we had physical boards, right? So we needed to bring them in. How do you do that when somebody's working from home? Well, Agile coach would put a laptop on his head and just hold it and bring that person physically into the space. Same, we did try I don't know if you've seen the iPad on the rolly stick thing. We did try that as well. It worked okay. But it was at least like, let's bring the virtual person physically into the space. So the last challenge we're going to talk about, and probably the most obvious one, is communication and how to handle communication in distributed teams. The issue with communication in distributed teams is you have two different, and let's say this could be physically co-located teams in different offices, or this could be people in a large, fully distributed team, but you have people in the same time zone and then people in other time zones. So different groups in co-located or near time zones. In any situation like this, unless you're fully distributed and fully distributed across multiple time zones, you end up with these things where you have very, very fast loops of communication. These fast loops of communication, if we're in the same office, I'm going to bump into you in the hallway, and let's say we have a big problem we're trying to solve. And I'm going to say, I was thinking about this problem. Can we talk about it for a minute? And we'll go find a whiteboard, and we'll spend, an hour working through the problem. Very, very high bandwidth communication. And then we go to the larger team, and we say, "Hey, everybody, we solved the problem." And so we find out that some other group in a different city says, "Well, we solved the problem, too." "Well, how did you solve it?" "Well, we solved it this way." "How did you solve it?" "We solved it this way." Well, that doesn't make any sense. What happened is our high bandwidth communication created a lot of context between us, but that context is lost when you have these slower bandwidth communication links. And this is the classical challenge of a distributed team. And this is what leads to Conway's law, as a matter of fact, right? High bandwidth communication loops and slow bandwidth communication loops. How do you manage that? Because it's not a great result. You end up with a lot of arguments, a lot of kind of lack of context. One is to just use fewer channels, right? So when you have distributed teams, one thing they tend to do is use lots of communication. We're just going to have tons of communication channels. Actually, I would argue to use fewer communication channels and just be very rigorous about them. Let's say in this scenario, I walk up to you and I say, hey, I've been working on this problem. I'd like to run it by you. And we talk for a minute or two and you say, okay, yeah, you know what? Let's take this conversation to Slack. And so I go to my desk and you go to your desk, and now we're still talking in that high bandwidth real-time thing, but we're doing it on Slack. And the benefit of doing it on Slack is that history of the conversation is preserved for everyone. Anyone can get that context, right? I can rewind the conversation. But also, if somebody else is not sitting in our office, but is sitting in like Krakow or something instead of Budapest, they actually can participate in the conversation at that high bandwidth. And yeah, it's not the same as having a talking conversation because we're typing, but you know what, we're developers, we type pretty fast. But this history is preserved and this context is preserved. And so if we're talking between Budapest and Vienna and Krakow and Warsaw or something, and then New York wakes up in a few hours, right, they can go and read the whole conversation, be completely up to speed, and then contribute as well. And that's very, very hard if we don't have these kinds of things. And you don't have to use Slack, you can use Google Docs or whatever. I mean, it's important just that you have fewer channels of communication and ones that preserve history. Similarly, documenting clearly. When you do make a decision, not only say, congratulations, we are now using 4-space tabs. Waiting for somebody to throw something at me. Okay, good. Because 4-space tabs are the right amount, is correct. Spaces, not tabs. I'm old. Documenting the decision, and when you document it, not only do you document the final decision, we're using Kubernetes, right? You document how we got to that decision. And especially if you have different teams in different time zones that are not necessarily participating in every part of the decision-making process, that's very, 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 very important, because now they're not having to wait for you to wake up so you can explain to them why this decision was made. It's also, by the way, really great when you have people who join the organization later and they're like, why do we do this? This doesn't make any sense to me. And you can give them that documentation. Another thing I just want to tell people, because I see this happen a lot, this is a weird mistake, but it's an obvious one for those of us who like to play with stuff. Don't get obsessed about tools, especially because this kind of distributed way of working is becoming so common. There's like 1.5 zillion tools, and there's ones, there's teams I meet with, and it's like, oh, well, we use this tool for retrospectives, we use this tool for planning, we use this tool for bug tracking, we use this tool for communication about code, we use this tool for communication about process. And, you join that team, and you have to learn like 85 freaking tools just to like do anything. And then, of course, like if you're doing that, it's like, well, this retrospective tool is, I think, a little bit better. Why don't we try this retrospective tool now, right? Because there's just 1 zillion of these tools. Use fewer tools. Make your life easier. Use more general purpose tools instead of just trying to recreate everything you can do physically to do it virtually. Just because teams I see just spend ridiculous amounts of time just playing with new tools all the time. This one's kind of obvious thing, establish common working times. If you're in a distributed team, hopefully you do this, but you'd be surprised how infrequently I do this. So as I mentioned, we're in London, Lisbon, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. So London, Lisbon, same time zone, Albuquerque, New Mexico, 7 hours off. So yeah, that's a bit of an inconvenient. However, just normally, guess what? We have 2 hours of overlap. So Albuquerque comes to work at a reasonable time, like 9 a.m., and they start working, and it's 4 p.m. in London, and then we have a couple hours of overlap because we actually start a little bit later in London to maximize the overlap. So we can have like our big meetings, all the big meetings in the UK start at the end of the day because we actually have a fairly sizable team in the US. And we've done that very purposefully. And periodically somebody say, well, why don't you start a new team in India or a few hours east of London? And the problem I have is now that team will have no overlap. And because the way I say it is we lean west in London because we have such a large team in the US and we want to maximize the overlap there. That makes it very, very difficult for teams that are further east of us. So that was a very deliberate decision, and we are very, very conscious of that because we want to have at least a few hours of overlap without people having to get up early or stay up late in order to have it. So that's the last sort of very practical piece of advice. I just want to sum up now. The modern workforce is distributed, right? This is, if you're not really doing this, you probably will soon. And the reason is this. There's awesome developers in Budapest. There's awesome developers in Warsaw. There's awesome developers in Stockholm. There's awesome developers in Kuala Lumpur. There's awesome developers in Sao Paulo, in Mexico City, in New York City, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And it is a travesty that we can't build teams out of the best people that we can find across the world. But even still, we want to give people who are working in the same office the amount of flexibility that if their kid's sick, they can work from home. Or if they have to have a doctor's appointment, they don't have to take an entire day off work. So the modern workforce is distributed. Obviously, that's going to create challenges, but those challenges can absolutely be overcome. And you get the benefit of those distributed teams, a little bit of overhead, but it's very much worth it. Thank you.
That was a lot of great practical advice.
Thank you. I try and be practical. I try and give you stuff you can use.
That's great. Fellow note taker.
All right.
Let's get going on these questions. When you bring your teams together face to face, what kind of activities do you do to improve the collaboration? Anything particular?
So I like to do stuff because we generally try and have, if we have people in offices, we have those teams work together. So when we go cross-site, it's usually trying to break down some of the silos between the teams and get people to talk to each other. One of the things that I really like doing is unconference. So in an unconference, for those of you who've done it, the people who arrive get to decide what the topics are. So usually you get a bunch of developers together, and they're going to bring up technical topics, and then whoever wants to talk about that, which is a great way of kind of breaking down silos. But we'll do that, or we'll do that, and then maybe once in a while we'll mix that up with all going on a boat ride or something like that, where we're just hanging out and talking to each other.
Okay, I've never heard of Unconference before. That's great.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Unconference. Great tool.
How do you onboard new people in a remote team? Where'd you go? I assume you cannot call a team on site each time.
So we absolutely bring people on site. So when because we have a lot of distributed folks out on Fido, so when you join the company, you come to London. I think eventually, because we now have the Lisbon office is getting pretty big, the Albuquerque office is following. Eventually, we may onboard you there, but since the beginning of the company, we bring you to London. You spend at least a week, usually two, just meeting people in London and onboarding as a group. So you always onboard with a group of people, and those people are usually distributed across the world.
So you do each and every individual gets to onboard?
Every individual comes to London, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great, okay. How to deal with the information overload when all communication is on Slack? I have found that when we've done that, I couldn't keep up with the flood of messages on the Slack.
Yeah, so no, that's information overload, and we had a little bit of discussion about that yesterday in that talk. Yeah, it's a challenge, but it's a general challenge anyway. I think the challenge with a distributed team is how do I selectively, and by the way, I've been in teams where we've tried to experiment with what information do we put in something like Slack and what do we not, and me personally, I don't want you deciding what I should or shouldn't know. I would rather deal with the information overload and allow people to sort of opt out than to try and selectively choose for them what they should or shouldn't know or participate in. Okay. So having lots and lots of channels, actually, which we do, we have a ridiculous number of channels at Fido, that's fine because I can select in very specifically and I can pay attention more to some channels and less to others.
Okay. Have you done team building events over Zoom? Can you build a human connection that way? And if not, do you think that that could work if you haven't done it yourself?
I haven't done team building events over Zoom, although I have done, I have seen teams do like board games over Zoom or like Dungeons and Dragons over Zoom. I think it helps. I mean, anything where you're not just interacting with each other in a very strict work context is going to help. And I do know some teams that are very distributed will spend a little bit of time at the beginning of every meeting, like talking about personal lives and trying to humanize. Generally, I wouldn't focus so much on trying to do. We did an experiment out in FIDO called last summer. That was actually that slide I showed us discussing that, where we tried to do an education event called Follow the Sun. It was 24 hours of presentations because the company is spread out over 24 time zones. And yeah, I don't know if that worked out well.
So something is better than nothing, but better something else.
Than nothing, but yeah.
Okay.
Haven't solved that one.
Fair enough. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you,
We have here
everybody.
a new notebook for you.
Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate it.